Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. Chapter 12. Calvin at Strasburg. Calvin at Strasburg. Rome draws near to Geneva. Farel at Neuchâtel. Calvin at Strasburg. His labors there. Disorders at Geneva. Calvin's poverty. Efforts of Rome to retake Geneva. Cardinal Sadoleto. His letter to the Genevans. Who shall reply to it? Calvin does so. Rising tide of the Reformation. Ebb of Romanism. Conference between the Protestants and the Romanists at Frankfurt. Calvin goes there. No fruit of the conference. Calvin and Melanchthon's interviews. Calvin's confidence in Melanchthon. His tender love for him. Calvin and Luther never meet. Luther placed amid the Teutonic peoples. Calvin amid the Latin nations. Wisdom of this arrangement. With steps slow and sad, and looks cast behind, for it was hard to relinquish all hope of a city on which they had bestowed so much labor, did the two banished ministers pursue their uncertain way. After an ineffectual attempt on the part of Bern and Zurich to compose the quarrel, Farel went to Neuchâtel, which became the field of his future labors, and thus he completed the building of which he had laid the foundations in years gone by. Calvin, journeying by way of Basel, and halting a while in a city which he loved above all others, ultimately repairing to Strasburg, to which he had been earnestly invited by the two pastors of that city, Bucer and Capito. 3 years of honorable labor awaited him in Strasburg. Distinguished foreigners, exiles for the Gospels, gathered round him. The French refugees, said to be about 15,000 in number, forming themselves into a congregation, made him their pastor. And the town council, appropriating the church of the Dominicans to his use, appointed him to give lectures on the Scriptures. His audience was a more erudite and polished one than any Geneva would then furnish, for only through Calvin was Geneva to become learned. The love of Strasburg was as balm to the smitten and wounded heart of the exile. The expulsion of the two ministers did not calm the tempest that raged in the little state on the banks of the Leman. The council, perhaps, to show that they could govern without Calvin, published some new edicts for the reformation of manners, but alas, moral power had departed with the ministers, and the commands of the magistrates were unheeded. The more distant the retreating steps of Farel and Calvin, the louder grew the disorders in the city they had left. The preachers, Marcourt and Morand, who now occupied the vacant pulpits, were simply objects of contempt. They soon quitted the city in disgust. The council thought to make the two rectors of the school which Farel had opened, for though there were 900 priests, there was not a schoolmaster in Geneva, supply their place. The two teachers rose up and shook the dust from their feet, and the school was closed. The dominant faction had demanded liberty, and now, left without either religious guide or secular instructor, they were in a fair way of being as free as their hearts could wish. and eminently pious to boot, if there be truth in the maxim that ignorance is the mother of devotion. Calvin, in his new sphere at Strasburg, preached 4 times a week, and discharged all the other duties, private and public, of a faithful pastor. He lectured every day on theological science to the students of the academy, taking as his textbook the Gospel of St. John and the Epistle to the Romans, which he expounded. The fame of his lectures drew students from other countries, and Strasburg promised to rival Wittenberg as a school of theology. The reformer had asked no salary from the magistrates, and they were in no haste to assign him one, and now he was in deep poverty. He appears to have been still in receipt of a small sum from his paternal inheritance, which he strove to supplement by the sale of his books. Painful it must have been to him to part with these, but he had no alternative, for we find him writing to Farel at this time that he did not possess a farthing. The Senate of Strasburg afterward appointed him a stipend, but so small that it did not suffice for his wants. But we return to Geneva. Calvin being gone, the Pope now drew near. He had been watching the ripening of the pear for some time, and now he deemed it fit to be plucked. Cardinal Sadoleto was employed to write a letter to the people of Geneva, which, it was thought, was all that was needed to make them re-enter the old fold. Other than Sadoleto, no fitter man could have been found for this task, having passed his youth at the court of Leo X. He was quite as much a son of the Renaissance as a son of the Church. He overflowed with that mild tolerance which, bred of indifferentism, is sometimes mistaken for true liberality. He could write any number of fine sentiments in the purest Latin. He was of irreproachable life. The Protestants sometimes thought that he was about to become one of them, but no, he loved the calm of letters and the atheistic delights of art. Above all, he rejoiced in the security and comfort of an infallible church. It saved the toil of inquiry and the torment of doubt. His letter to the Senate and people of Geneva was such as might have been expected from such a man. He began by protesting his ancient affection for them. He praised their many noble qualities, and he drowned his page with his poignant grief at their misfortunes. Alas, that they had suffered themselves to be seduced into Protestantism, which, however, he was good enough to say contained a modicum of truth. And so, tasking the elegance of his pen to the utmost, he coined some glowing compliments in praise of Holy Writ, of Christ as the sole author of salvation, and of the doctrine of justification by faith. In thus expressing himself, Sadoleto had not the remotest intention of becoming a disciple of the Protestant faith. He was only beckoning back the Genevans to repose beneath the tiara. In an infallible church only could they find escape from such storms as the exercise of private judgment had let loose upon them. The letter had the very opposite effect from that which it was expected to produce. It helped to show the men of Geneva the brink to which they were drawing nigh. Are we then, they said to themselves on reading the cardinal's letter, so near to Rome that the pontiff believes he has only to open the gates in order that we may come in? Moreover, it made them feel the loss they had sustained in the banishment of Calvin. They looked around for a man to reply to Sadoleto, for they felt that his letter must not remain unanswered. But they looked in vain. One name was on every lips, as that of the man who alone was adequate to the task of replying. But with the ink not yet dry, and the banishment of the man who bore that name was written, they dared not utter it. This showed, however, that the tide had begun to turn. Calvin, meanwhile, got a copy of the cardinal's letter at Strasburg, and without waiting to be asked by the Genevans, he answered it forthwith. and in such fashion that Sadoleto made no second attempt of the sort. Calvin's reply to Sadoleto was the work of 6 days, and it remains a monument of his genius. He begins by paying a fine compliment to the cardinal's learning and eloquence, and goes on to express his wonder at the singular love and goodwill which Sadoleto, an entire stranger to the people of Geneva, had so suddenly conceived for them, of which nevertheless no fruit ever appeared. If, continues Calvin, it was ambition and avarice, as Sadoleto had hinted, which moved him in separating from Rome, what a blunder he had fallen into. Certain it is, said he, if I had paid regard to my personal advantage, I should never have separated from your faction. Was not, he asked, our shortest way of attaining to wealth and honors to accept from the first the conditions of which you have offered us? Apostates you call us, says Calvin. The men of Geneva, extricating themselves from the slough of error in which they were sunk, have returned to the doctrine of the gospel. And this thou callest abandoning the truth of God. They have withdrawn from papal tyranny, and this thou sayest is to separate from the church. We contradict the fathers? Exclaimed the reformer, adverting to another charge the cardinal had brought against the Protestants. We are more nearly in agreement with antiquity than you, our opponents, as thou knowest, Sadoleto, and we ask for nothing else than to see restored that ancient face of the church which has been torn to pieces and almost destroyed by the Pope and his faction. And after reminding the cardinal of what his learning made him well acquainted with, namely the condition of the church during the days of both the Greek and Latin fathers, Calvin asked him, wilt thou call that man an enemy of antiquity who, full of zeal for ancient piety, longs to restore in their first splendor the things which are now corrupted? With what right are we accused of having subverted the ancient discipline by the very party that has abolished it? With a few strokes, Calvin next draws a picture of the state in which the reformers found the schools and pulpits. Nothing taught in the first but pure sophistries, tangled and twisted scholastic theology, a kind of secret magic. And as for the pulpits, there were no sermons, from which foolish old women did not learn more dreams than they could relate in a month by their own fireside. Was it a crime to have replaced that rubbish by a theology drawn from the Word of God, and to have silenced the monks by filling the pulpits with preachers of the ancient gospel? There follow some noble passages on justification by faith, on Christ's sole mediatorship, on worship, the Lord's Supper, the ministry, the church, and then comes the close, in which the reformer reproduces, though in a contrary sense, Sadoleto's prosopopoeia. The cardinal had cited Calvin and his brethren as criminals before the judgment seat of God. Calvin obeys this trumpet summons. He comes to the dread tribunal to which the cardinal had cited him. And he thus pleads, I saw Christ cast into oblivion and become unprofitable. What was I to do? I saw the gospel stifled by superstition. What was I to do? I saw the divine word voluntarily ignored and hidden. What was I to do? If he is not to be reputed a traitor who, seeing the soldiers dispersed and scattered, raises the captain's ensign, rallies them, and restores their order, am I a traitor for having raised amid the disbanded church the old banner of Jesus Christ? For it is not a new and strange ensign which I have unfurled, but thy noble standard, O Lord. He adds with reference to Sadoleto's taunt that they had broken the peace. Did they, the Romanists, not most suddenly and furiously betake themselves to the sword and the gibbet? Did they not think that their sole resource was in arms and cruelty? They have given us in default of other consecration that of tribulation and blood. We know what we have done, and in whom we have believed, and heaven grant Sadoleto, that thou and thine may one day be able to say as much sincerely. Thus did Calvin, though banished, continue to cover Geneva with his shield. The writing ran quickly through Europe. Luther read it, and was delighted beyond measure with it. His eye at once discerned its freedom, strength, and majesty. Here, said he, is a writing which has hands and feet. I rejoice that God raises up such men. They will continue what I have begun against Antichrist, and by the help of God, they will finish it. Calvin has now become, or is very soon to become, the center of the movement, whose present position in Christendom is somewhat perilous. A crisis had arrived in the great conflict between Romanism and Protestantism. It was clear to both parties that the breach that divided them must be healed now, and that if a settlement was much longer delayed, the controversy would grow into an embittered and sanguinary war, prolonged from decade to decade, and it might be for a still longer period. During the years that Calvin resided at Strasburg, the Popish and Protestant worlds assembled in not fewer than 4 successive conventions to try whether it was not possible to frame a basis on which the two churches might come together, and peace be restored to Christendom. The initiative of these conferences was taken by the emperor on the part of the Romanists, and indeed, of the two parties, it was the latter that had the stronger reasons for holding out the olive branch. 25 years had now passed away in their efforts to put down Protestantism, and instead of being able to recount a series of victories, they had little to show save a list of defeats. All things worked contrariwise for them. If they held a disputation, it was only to expose the weakness of their champions. If they convoked a synod, it was only to hear a Protestant confession. If they held a conference, it was to have some new concession wrung from them. If they planted stakes, they found they were but sowing the seed of new martyrs. If they leagued among themselves in order to strike a combined blow, some untoward event fell out, some ally betrayed them, or the ominous figure of the Turk started up, and so their plans came to nothing. The bow broke just as the arrow was about to let fly. And then, what at this hour was the attitude of the several nations as regarded their obedience to the papal chair? One half of the European states had placed themselves, or were hastening to do so, beneath the banner on which was inscribed, an open Bible and a free conscience. The two Saxonies, Prussia, Hesse, Kassel, Württemberg, with some smaller states and a multitude of free cities, were now ranged round the great protest. The better half of Switzerland was lost to Rome. Few save the herdsmen of the mountains now received her pardons and sent their money in return. Denmark and Sweden had revolted. The powerful kingdoms of England and France were at that hour trembling in the balance. Everywhere men were kicking against Rome's ancient and sacred sway, and soon, on the north of the Alps, few subjects would remain to her. Parliaments were passing laws to check her usurpations. Her bulls were dishonored. Pauls were at a discount. Tithes, annats, reservations, and expectatives were but as the gleanings after the harvest. Palmers and anchorets were disappearing from her highways. Men were burying her relics instead of worshipping them. The cow and frock were being abandoned for the garb of honest labor. Schools and hospitals were replacing monasteries and convents. The reading of the Scriptures was supplanting the counting of beads, and the preaching of the gospel, the chanting of litanies and masses. And then, in addition to all these losses, when the Romanists looked at the other side, they could not conceal from themselves the strength of the Protestant position. Not only did the Reformation divide Christendom, not only did it receive the support of states, princes and free cities, but further it had created a multitude of agencies, which were continually at work multiplying its adherents and extending still farther its area. Foremost among these were the sacred oracles in the mother tongue of the nations. Following after this divine instrumentality came nearly all the men of thought, of letters, and of eloquence which the age could boast. Ever and anon Luther's pen was darting flashes of light over Europe. Recently had come that magnificent demonstration, the Institutes. That work was moving up and down in Christendom, an embattled phalanx of argument, compared with which the legions of the emperor were as weakness. Around the two great chiefs, Luther and Calvin, were 100 keen and disciplined intellects, ready to expose a sophism, to confront a falsehood, to laugh at folly, and to castigate hypocrisy and arrogance. Moreover, the habit of free inquiry and the art of combining, of which the Schmalkald League furnished an example, which was not lost upon its opponents, had come to the aid of that cause which had given them birth. In fine, among the forces on the side of Protestantism, not the least was the spirit of its disciples. They could face the dungeon and the rack, the scaffold and the stake, and not quail. And in the room of those who are burned to ashes today, hundreds would start up tomorrow to grasp the falling standard and bear it onward to victory. These considerations could not but force themselves upon the minds of the Romanists, and weigh with them the overtures they now made to the Protestants. From the far-off banks of the Tagus came a letter full of not unfriendly professions. Writing in the Alcazar at Toledo, the 25th of November, 1539, the emperor invited the Protestant princes of Germany to meet and try whether they could not devise measures of conciliation. Charles intimated at the same time that the King of France, with whom he was then at peace, was equally solicitous on this point with himself. In pursuance of this letter, the princes assembled next February at Frankfurt. Eldo, Archbishop of London, represented the emperor at the conference. Calvin, accompanied by Sturm, went thither at the urgent solicitations of his brethren, mainly with the view of watching over the interests of the Swiss churches, and of having the pleasure of meeting and conferring with Melanchthon. The debates were long, but the conclusions reached were of no great moment. All resulted in a truce which was to last for 15 months, to permit a convention of theologians and learned men to meet and discuss the steps necessary for quieting the religious troubles. Without the truce, the members would not have been sure of their heads. Meanwhile, prosecutions against the Protestants in the imperial chamber were to be dropped, and no one on either side was to be disturbed on account of his religion. The Protestants thought they saw the cloven foot in the attempts to confine this agreement to those of the Augsburg Confession. The emperor had the best reason for excluding the Swiss from its benefits. He knew that should the German and Swiss reformers combine and form one Protestant camp, extending from the Baltic to the banks of the Rhone and the foot of the Pennine Mountains, the cause of Rome would be lost north of the Alps, and his own dynastic projects along with it. We turn with a peculiar pleasure from the chamber of conference to the yet more sacred chamber where the Reformation's greatest scholar and its greatest theologian were about to commune together. From the first moment, Melanchthon and Calvin understood each other. Of Melanchthon's inviolable loyalty at heart to the Protestant creed, Calvin had not a doubt. The unwise concessions into which his love of peace at times betrayed him, though they drew forth Calvin's rebuke, never shook his confidence in him. A free interchange of sentiments on the nature of the Eucharist took place, and Calvin, as we learn from his letters to Farel, was delighted to find that Melanchthon's opinions approximated with his own, although his veneration for Luther kept him from saying so in public. Future discussions, however, showed that the unanimity was not quite so great as Calvin had hoped. Their friendship nevertheless continued unbroken throughout their lives, and yielded its fruits to the Church of God. How deep and tender Calvin's love for Melanchthon was, is shown by the touching words written after the grave had closed over the latter. O Philip Melanchthon, for it is thou whom I address, thou who now livest in the hand of God with Christ, awaiting us on high till we are gathered with thee into blessed repose. 100 times hast thou said to me, wearied with toil and vexation, thou didst lean thy head upon my bosom. Would to God that I might die upon that bosom. As for me, later 100 times I have wished that it had been granted us to be together. Certainly thou would have been bolder to face struggles, more courageous to despise envy and calumny, malignity of many whose audacity increased in proportion to what they called thy timidity. There's one other meeting that would have greater interest for us than even that which we see now taking place. It was intensely longed for, on one side at least. Writing to Luther, Calvin says, "Oh, if I could fly toward thee, and enjoy thy society, were it but for a few hours." One cannot help asking, had Luther and Calvin met, which would have appeared the greater? Would the breach in the Protestant host have been healed, and the Wittenberg and Genevan camps been merged into one? Would the splendor of Luther have palled before the calm majesty of Calvin? Or would the mighty strength of the latter have bowed before the swift intuition and dazzling genius of the former? But it was not to be that these two men should ever see one another in the flesh. They were formed to dwell in spheres apart. The impetuous Luther was given to the Teutonic nations, which needed his enthusiasm to kindle them. Calvin was placed amid the excitable and volatile peoples of the South, where his severe logic and love of order helped to curb their tendency to excess and their passion to theorize. Had Luther gone to France, and there was a moment outside the gate of Augsburg on the occasion of his flight from Cajetan, when he thought of turning his horse's head in that direction, he would have kindled a conflagration by his eloquence, which, after speedily blazing up, would as speedily have sunk down and died out. And had Calvin, when he first visited Strasburg, instead of turning southward to Basel, gone forward to Wittenberg, and made Germany the scene of his labors, as he had some thoughts of doing, he would there doubtless have been able to plant his system of church order, but without that amount of enthusiasm on the part of those who submitted to it, necessary to give it permanency, or to carry it over Christendom, while the South would have become a prey to the pantheistic theories of such men as Oken and Servetus. What a beautiful ordering in the gifts of these two men, in the place assigned to each in the field, and the time when they entered it. Luther had been the center in the first act of the great drama. That was now closing, and the center of the second act, which was about to open. Calvin stands up, with an enthusiasm as great, but a logic more severe, to complete and crown the work of his predecessor. Chapter 13. Abortive Conferences at Hagenau and Ratisbon. Convention at Hagenau. Attempt to steal a march on the Protestants. Firmness of the German princes. Conference at Ratisbon. Perplexities of Charles V. Cardinal Contarini. Program. Auspicious beginning of conference. Agreement on several doctrines. The deadlock of transubstantiation. Hopes come to nothing. Would conciliation have been a blessing to Christendom? It would have given entombment to Protestantism and new life to atheistic revolution. The next convention was held at Hagenau, the 25th of June, 1540. The assembly was presided over by King Ferdinand. The Protestant princes were represented by their deputies. A great number of divines were present, and among others Calvin. Melanchthon was taken ill on the road, and was thus unavoidably absent. Ferdinand, on the ground that the Protestant princes were not present, adjourned the assembly to meet at Worms on October 28th. Meanwhile, it was attempted to steal a march on the Protestants by requiring them to restore the buildings, lands, and revenues which they had taken from the Papists, and to promise that no new members would be received into the Smalcald League. These proposals were indignantly rejected. First, let the religious question be decided, said the Protestants, and then the details will adjust themselves. They had robbed no man. The appropriated church revenues they had devoted to the religious instruction of the people, to the support of the schools, and the relief of the poor. And as to refusing the protection of the League to those who were persecuted for righteousness' sake, they spurned the idea of binding themselves to so dastardly a policy. Calvin, who was not readily imposed upon, nor easily satisfied, bears the highest testimony in his letters to the zeal of these men, as he witnessed it at Frankfurt. Sooner than dissolve their league and abandon defenseless provinces and towns to the will of the emperor and the pope, they would see their cities plowed as a field, their castles razed, and themselves led to the scaffold. The conference assembled at Worms, as appointed, but on the third day came letters from the emperor dissolving it, and summoning it to meet with greater solemnity at Ratisbon in January 1541. The members not arriving in time, the Diet of Ratisbon opened only in April. Calvin, deputed by the city of Strasburg, went there, though he expected little from the conference. Mistrusting the sincerity of the Roman managers, and knowing perhaps better than any other man that an impossible task had been assigned to them when they were required to reconcile essentially antagonistic creeds, and yet many things seemed to prognosticate a prosperous issue to this, the fourth attempt within the space of 2 years to effect the pacification of Christendom. First, the position of the emperor's affairs made it clearly his interest to be on friendly terms with the princes of the Protestant League. He was raising armies, expending vast sums, wasting his years and strength, and taxing his genius in toilsome expeditions and mighty undertakings, and yet the perplexities around his throne were thickening instead of lessening. Verily, he had no need to court new difficulties. Charles spoke truth doubtless when, by the mouth of Grenville, he opened a diet with these words, when he perceived how religion had torn and rent asunder the empire, and given occasion to the Turk to pierce almost into the bowels of Germany. It had been a great grief to him, and therefore, for many years past he had, with their own consents, been essaying ways of pacification. The Pope, Paul III, leaned scarcely less than the emperor towards conciliation. In token of his friendly disposition, he sent Gaspar Contarini as his legate to the conference. A patrician of Venice by birth, Cardinal Contarini was of pure life, of devout disposition, and of liberal opinions. He had been a member of the Oratory of Divine Love, an association which sought to promote a large reform of church abuses, and on the important doctrine of justification approximated very closely to Luther. Not less desirous were the Protestant divines of healing the breach, provided it could be done without burying the Reformation. When they thought of the sacrifice which the continuance of the struggle implied, the desolations of war, and the blood that must flow on field and scaffold, they shrunk from the responsibility of hastily closing the door against any really well-meant attempt at union. At no former moment had peace been so near. The proceedings began by Grenville presenting to the conference a book, which he said had received the Emperor's approval, and which he wished them to adopt as the basis of their discussions. The book consisted of a series of chapters or treatises on the doctrines, the rites, the sacraments, the orders, and the constitution and powers of the Church. The members were to say what in it they agreed with, and what in it they dissented from. The Pope naturally wished the weighty point of his supremacy to be the first taken in hand and settled. But Contarini, departing from his instruction in this matter, postponed the question of the Pope's powers to the end, and gave precedence to the doctrines of the Christian system. For some time all went smoothly enough. A very tolerable unanimity was found to exist between the two sides of the assembly on the doctrines of original sin, free will, and justification. Calvin was astonished to find the Romanists conceding so much. "We have retained," says he, writing to Farel, "all the substance of the true doctrine. If you consider with what kind of men we have had to agree, you will acknowledge that much has been accomplished." As yet no cloud appeared in the sky of the conference. Next came the subject of the Church. The conference was agreed on the constitution of the Church. As regards its authority, it began to be seen that there were two parties in the assembly. To obviate immediate danger, it was proposed to pass on to other questions, and to leave this one for future settlement. The sacraments followed. The Diet was nearing the more critical questions. There was here some jarring, but the Protestants conceded the ceremonies as things indifferent, and the conference was able to proceed. At last came the consideration of the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. There, said Calvin, stood the impassable rock which barred the way to farther progress. I had, continues Calvin, to explain in Latin what were my sentiments, without fear of offense. I condemned that particular local presence. The act of adoration I declared to be altogether insufferable. We now behold the representatives of the Popish and Protestant worlds gathered in presence of the Roman Sphinx, the stupendous mystery of transubstantiation. If they shall resolve the riddle, reconcile the dogma to Scripture, to reason, to sense, all will be well. They will have united the two churches and pacified Europe. But if they shall fail, there awaits Christendom a continuance of divisions, of strife, of wars. One after another comes forward with his solution, in the hope that, like another Oedipus, he will read the riddle, disarm the monster, and avert from Christendom the untold calamities with which it is threatened. First come the Protestants. Philip and Bucer, says Calvin, have drawn up ambiguous and insincere formulas to try whether they could satisfy the opposite part by yielding nothing. He bears his testimony to their best intentions, but expects nothing of their equivocation. Next come the Romanists. They envelop the whole in a cloud of mystification. The riddle is still unread. The mystery still stands unsolved, despite the learning, the wit, and the sophistry which have been expended upon it to make it comprehensible. It is as defiant of Scripture, of reason, and of sense as ever. At this stage, An incident partly tragic and partly grotesque came to diversify the proceedings of the convention. One day, the veteran controversialist, Dr. Eck, being worsted by Melanchthon in an argument on the Eucharist, went home in a rage, and drank so deep at supper as to drown his sense of discomfiture and contract a fever at the same time. His gruff stentorian voice was heard no more in the debates, nor his tall, broad shoulder and burly form seen in the conference hall. Afterwards the question of private masses, invocation of saints, and the Pope's supremacy received a languid discussion, but with no satisfactory results. The skies, so fair when the conference assembled, were now overcast with heavy clouds. The promise of peace had failed. The emperor dissolved the Diet, with the promise, always forthcoming, when affairs had got into a deadlock, that a general council would speedily convene, and that, should the Pope refuse to call such, he himself would convoke a Diet of the Empire for the settlement of all the religious differences of Christendom. So ended the Diet of Ratisbon. Had it succeeded in uniting the two churches, the history of the world would henceforward have been different. Would it have been better? We answer unhesitatingly, it would have been worse. God's plans are not only larger and wiser, but more beneficent than the thoughts of man. A union on only such terms as were then possible would have closed the career of Protestantism, for a half-reformation would have been no reformation. Would then the Church of Rome, her doctrines modified, we shall suppose, her worst abuses corrected, and her sway become more tolerant, have resumed possession of Europe, and pursued her course unobstructed by rival or opponent? We reply emphatically, it would not. The popish champions altogether overlooked the forces which were at work in Christendom when they lay the misfortunes of their church at the door of Protestantism. The Church of Rome was morally bankrupt before the reformers arose. The nations had lost their faith in her. The pantheistic principles which had been springing up ever since the 12th century were fast coming to a head. And but for the moral breakwater which Luther and Calvin erected, they would have by the end of the 16th century have broken out and swept over Europe in all the fury of a destructive revolution. Protestantism did not awaken. It mitigated the angry feelings of which Rome was the object, and diverted them into a channel of scriptural reformation. The Christendom of that day was called to make its choice between the teachers of morality and order, such as Calvin, and the apostles of atheism, with its attendant crimes, revolutions, and woes, such as Castellio and Servetus. Unhappily, the Roman Church mistook her friends for her foes. We would ask, how has it fared with her in those countries which remained popish? Is it in lands where the Reformation established itself, or in those where it was suppressed, that the Church has been most exempt from spoliation, and her priests from violence? And to what shore is it that they flee in those oft-recurring tempests of revolution that sweep across the popish world? The Reformation, in its Lutheran form, had now culminated. It had planted in the mind of Christendom the great radical principle of renovation, salvation through grace. But instead of building upon it an organized church, to act as a moral breakwater against the godless principles ready to rush in and fill the void caused by the partial demolition of Romanism, the Reformation in Germany was passing into political action. It was running to seed. What was needed was a vigorous church. What was formed was a political league. A new center had to be found for the principle of Protestantism, where, disentangling itself from political alliances, it might grow into a great purifying and restraining power, and be seen by the world not simply as a body of doctrines, but as a new and holy society, while a number of cunning artificers at Ratisbon are trying to repair the old fabric and keep it from falling, a new building is rising elsewhere. Chapter 14. Calvin returns to Geneva. The movement must resume its march. Calvin at Strasburg. The libertines at Geneva. Calvin's 4 persecutors perish. Tide turns at Geneva. Deputations to entreat Calvin's return. The idea of going back terrible to him. Bucer's adjuration. Starts on his return journey. Enters Geneva. Reception. Lessons learned in exile. Returns more fit for his work. Idolette de Bure. His salary, etc. Had the Diet at Ratisbon succeeded in finding what both parties in the convention so sincerely labored to discover, a basis of agreement, Calvin would not have returned to Geneva. There would have been no need to seek a new center for a Reformation which had run its course, and was about to disappear from the stage. It was saved, however, from the entombment which agreement would have given it. The movement is again to resume its march. Its second and grandest act is about to open, and accordingly Calvin is on his way back to Geneva. While living honored in Strasburg, each day occupied in fruitful labors, interrupted only by attendances at imperial diets, the public feeling respecting the reformer had been undergoing a great change on the banks of the Leman. The faction of the libertines, reinforced by Anabaptists and Papists, grew every day more ungovernable. Licentiousness and tumult ran riot now that Calvin was gone. The year 1539 passed in the most outrageous saturnalia. The council, helpless in the face of these disorders, began to repent of what they had done. The 4 syndics who had been mainly active in the banishment of Calvin were now out of the way. One had perished on the scaffold, charged with the crime of surrendering Genevese territory. Another, accused of sedition, had attempted to escape by his window, but, falling headlong, broke his neck. His fellow citizen, on learning his tragic end, called to mind that he had said tauntingly to Calvin, surely the city gate was wide enough to let him go out. The 2 remaining syndics, implicated in the same charges, had betaken themselves to flight. All this happened in the same year and the same month. It was now 1540. The city register showed the daily rise in the tide of popular feeling for Calvin's recall. September 21st, the council charged Aimé Perrin, one of its members, to find means, if he could, to bring back Master Calvin. October 13th, it was resolved to write a letter to Monsieur Calvin that he would assist us. October 19th, the Council of 200 resolved, in order that the honor and glory of God may be promoted, to seek all possible means to have Master Calvin as preacher. October 20th, it was ordered in the General Council, or Assembly of the People, to send to Strasburg to fetch Master Jean Calvinus, who is very learned, to be minister in this city. The enthusiasm of the citizens is thus described by an eyewitness, Jacques Bernard. They all cried out, "Calvin, Calvin, we wish Calvin, the good and learned man, the true minister of Jesus Christ." 3 several deputations did Calvin send to entreat the return of the man whom, 2 years before, it had chased from its gates with insult and threats. The same 2 cantons, Bern and Zurich, whose approaches in the way of meditation it then repulsed, were now asked to use their good offices with the magistrates of Strasburg in order to overcome their unwillingness to forego Calvin's services. In addition to the Senate's advances, numerous private citizens wrote to the reformer in urgent terms soliciting his return. These letters found Calvin already on his way to the Diet at Worms, where the deputy of Geneva followed him. The repentant city opens its gates. Shall he go back? It was a critical moment, not in Calvin's history only, but in that of Christendom, though neither Calvin nor any other man could then estimate the momentous issues that hung upon his decision. The question of going back threw him into great perplexity. The 2 years he had already passed in Geneva, with the contradictions, perils, and insults with which they were filled up, rose vividly before him. If he returns, shall he not have to endure it all over again? Going back was like lying down on a bed of torture. The thought, he tells us, filled him with horror. Who will not pardon me, he writes, if I do not again willingly throw myself into a whirlpool which I have found so dangerous? He appeared to himself, of all men, the most unfit for a career as stormy as that which awaited him at Geneva. In a sense, he judged correctly. He was naturally shy. His organization was exquisitely striving. Sensitive and tender, he recoiled from the low arts and the coarse abuse of rough and unprincipled opponents. It was sympathy and love that he sought for. But it is exactly on a constitution like this that it is possible to graft the finest and loftiest courage. Qualities like these, when found in combination with high conscientiousness and lofty aims, as they were in Calvin's case, become changed under discipline, and in fitting circumstances develop into their opposites. The shrinking delicacy or timidity which quails before a laugh or a sneer disappears, and a chivalrous boldness comes into its room, which finds only delight in facing danger and confronting opposition. The sense of pain is absorbed in the conscious grandeur of the aim, and the sensitive man stands up in a courage which the whole world can neither bend nor break. Calvin disburdened his mind to his brethren, telling them with what apprehensions this call to his former field of labor had filled him, yet that he would obey, should they deem it his duty to go. They knew his worth, and were reluctant indeed to part with him. But when they thought on Geneva, situated on the borders of Italy and France, and offering so many faculties for carrying the light to these countries, they at once said, "This is your post of service." Not yet, however, could Calvin conquer his aversion. The city on the banks of the Leman was to him a chamber of torture. He shuddered to enter it. Thank you all for taking your time to listen to the history of Protestantism. Please like this recording wherever it is that you are listening to it. And as a special favor, I ask you all to go to crosstheborder.org and click on the cover of the volume that you are listening to, which will take you to the appropriate Amazon page. And please leave a 5-star review there and a brief comment about something that you've heard or read in that volume. Thank you so much for taking that little bit of extra time to support us.